Up next on the TWIP network, Gordon Lang and I review the Olympus OM-D E-M10 Mark II on All About the Gear. Hello and welcome to another episode of All About the Gear. Once again with my friend from Brighton, England, Mr. Gordon Lang. Good afternoon, Gordon.
Good morning, Doug. How are you?
I'm barely here. I'm barely here. As I said, first cup of coffee. No, can't we do something about these time zones? Can't we pass a law?
I think they do that in Russia, don't they? They have the same time zone for the whole country.
That's really smart.
You have a meeting at 12 o'clock. Everyone has a meeting at 12 o'clock, except for some of them, it's the middle of the night. It's really dark.
That's
and for
right.
other ones, it's daytime. So this is my last drink of the day because
good for you. All right. Well, that explains the difference in our temperament and everything. But luckily, you're the one who gets to do the review. You've got the camera. We're doing the Olympus OM-D E-M10 Mark II. I think it's going to set a record for the number of different characters and syllables in its name. Yeah, let's take a look at that camera. Cute little thing.
Yes, it is. This is the E-M10 Mark II. It's a pretty compact camera. As a Mark II, obviously, it's the successor to the OM-D E-M10 Mark I. It's a mid-range model from Olympus. Just as a reminder on Olympus's range, they do two different types of mirrorless cameras. They have the Pen series, which do not have built-in viewfinders, and they have the OM-D series, which do have built-in viewfinders. And this is an OM-D, so it has a viewfinder at the top here. As a mid-range model, it actually has quite a challenge on its hands because it has to appeal to people who are upgrading from a much simpler camera. So it has to keep things very simple and produce good results easily. But yet also as a mid-range camera, it has to appeal to people who want to take their photography to the next level. So it needs to be packed with features, but make them sufficiently accessible to both beginners and experts alike. And as a brief teaser to keep you going, I'd say it succeeds very well on both fronts.
Oh, very good. I'm likely to hear. I'm interested to hear about that. Now, I did the review here on All About the Gear with the original Olympus OM-D E-M10. Of course, it's quite diminutive. It's one of the smallest micro four thirds cameras, as I recall, and I was pretty impressed with it for its size. So tell us about the basics in terms of the price, what you get for that, and you know what's different about this camera.
Okay, you're looking at $649 US or about 550 UK pounds for the body, or about $800 US or about 650 UK pounds with this kit zoom. It's a very, very small kit zoom. If you're not watching the video, let me describe it to you. It's only about 2 centimeters thick when powered down. It's 14 to 42 millimeter, which in micro four thirds terms has a 2 times field reduction factor, which means it's equivalent to about 28 to 84 millimeter, which is a bit of a kind of classic kit zoom range. When I switch on the camera, you'll see the lens extend. A little bit fiddly there. As I switched it on, you'll see it extend there. So this is a collapsing kit zoom. If I switch it off, you'll see it retract again. Switch it on, there it goes out. Now, the benefit of retracting, collapsing kit zooms is that they're very small. As I already said, it's about 2 centimeters thick when it's powered down, which allows this camera to really slip into large pockets. You know, if you've got cargo pants or a big coat, you'll be able to fit this camera in. And if you're putting it in a bag, it occupies so little space, it's hardly worth mentioning. That's one of the things I really like about this format, is that you can carry the camera and so many lenses around in such a small part of your bag. The compromise with these small lenses, in terms of the collapsing kit zoom anyway, is that often they're not very good quality, especially towards the corners. Now, in my test with this camera, because I have already completed my test with it, it's actually not that bad. There are better quality lenses out there, especially in the micro four thirds format. The Panasonic kit zoom, which they supply with the G7, is a little bit sharper in the corners, but it's also a bigger lens. If I show you one of the rival models for the E-M10, this is Fujifilm's X-T10, which we're also going to be doing a video on. If you're not watching the video, I'd say, why aren't you watching the video? Because you would see that the Fujifilm kit zoom here, although this is the higher end kit zoom from Fuji, it must be about 4 times thicker. The body is roughly the same size. The Fuji X-T10 is a very compact body, but this becomes a much more serious camera to carry around because of its bigger lens, whereas the Olympus is very compact. And as I say, the image quality on this lens is much better than this other camera I'm holding up now, which is the Sony a6000. It has a collapsing kit zoom where the quality is horrible in the corners. but the Olympus stays respectable. So I think they've got the compromise just about right there. It's not fantastic, but it's not bad. And you can, of course, replace it with any number of lenses. My favorite option for this camera, and indeed the EM5 Mark II as well, is the Olympus 17mm f1.8 prime lens. It's only a little bit thicker than this, so it remains very, very compact, but the quality is superb. It's 1.8 aperture, which means you can use it in low light, and you can also achieve a relatively shallow depth of field at close range, and that is a fantastic lens to pair with this camera.
Now, we'll get back into the camera, but I need to take this opportunity to do a bit of a rant on this type of lens. I am really, really not a fan of these collapsing zooms. I'll tell you, I've got a few reasons for that. Like you said, this one on the A6000 is dreadful. It's only $150 more to buy it with this lens versus body only. That's not too bad, but here are a couple of things. One is, it appears to me that this is one of those that does not have a built-in lens cap. In other words, it doesn't cover over the front surface of the lens when you collapse it. And it seems to me that's a real missed opportunity, because if I want to throw something into my pocket, I don't want it to get all dirty and scratched from my pocket. And I don't want to have to carry a lens cap if I don't need one. That's one thing. The other is, I'm going to bet that when the camera times out, when the camera says, oh, I want to conserve the battery, I need to shut down, I'll bet it retracts the zoom. Is that correct?
I'm not going to say that that is 100% correct. It is correct in my experience with the default settings. But the thing with Olympus cameras is that there are pages upon pages of custom settings. And there may be one in there somewhere that I've not come across, which allows it to either not shrink back or more likely to reset itself to the previous focal length when you power it back up again or when you wake it back up again. But even that said, though, there is that process of it retracting and then coming back again. And you think, oh, no, it's kind of spoilt the moment. I know what you're saying. I also like lenses that when you put them on a certain focus distance and a certain zoom focal length, it stays there. Yeah. And unfortunately, this isn't so much like that.
And it also means that your effective startup time is substantially longer. You're looking at a couple of seconds to get this camera up and ready to go from the time it's powered down, right?
Yes, although interestingly, a lot of that is not actually down to the lens. You're right that if I switch this on, let's start counting, and I'm going to do it in thousands. Do you want to do it in elephants?
Yeah, you're right. Go ahead.
Let's do it both in elephants. Okay, you ready? 1, 2, 3. 1 elephant, two elephants later, and yeah, you see me on the screen. Look at that, beautiful, beautiful.
Oh, that must be a great lens. Must be a marvelous lens. You look so good.
Oh, thank you so much. It's about 2 seconds from power up to the image appearing on the screen and you being able to use the camera. That sounds like quite a long time, but when you actually put on a prime lens, which doesn't need to extend, or a normal zoom, it still takes about 2 seconds from cold until it's operational. So it's a bit deceptive, really. You can't really blame it for that. And actually, I do have to say, while I was just playing with it there, the manual focusing ring at the end, I mean, it's tiny, but it is damped very nicely. You can use this quite successfully manual focus, whereas again, the 16-50 kit zoom on the Sony APS-C mirrorless cameras, it feels really loose and scratchy. So yes, it's not a gorgeous lens, but it's not as bad as it could be.
Okay, well, one last thing though. What about the zooming? Because it's zoom by wire. Is
Yes.
it responsive, like as though it were a physical zoom ring, or is there quite a bit of lag in it?
There is a bit of lag. It's motorized, and there's pros and cons to that. The pro is that when it's motorized, you can get very smooth zooming action, which is great if you're filming video. If you try and zoom without a motorized focal length adjustment when you're filming video, it's impossible to do it smoothly, but the motorized ones let you do that. That's the positive spin on it. The negative spin on it is it's not very responsive. As you say, let's say I spot something over there and I think, oh, I've got to zoom it in really quick to take a picture of someone. If you're doing street photography, it doesn't feel, it's not lively enough. It's not, you don't feel as connected as you could do. So for street photography, this is not the right lens. It's a good kind of general purpose starter lens and a good one to kind of have to throw about. But I would prefer to use something else with this camera, ideally. Like I say, I really like the 17mm prime. That's a lens that I own as part of my own collection, because I do use Micro Four Thirds and Olympus bodies for a lot of my personal photography. So I felt very at home with this.
Yeah, yeah, that 17 is a great, it's a beautiful wide angle, 35 millimeter equivalent. Does a great job. Okay, I beat up on it enough. Let's go on to the good stuff and find out what's new. What did they upgrade now from the Mark 1 or the original EM10?
Okay, let's take a quick look at the outside of this camera. They've changed around some of the controls. Quite chunky buttons. Now, I really like this about Olympus. What they do is, obviously, it's very fashionable these days to have a retro-styled camera, and Olympus have done that. And there's lots of little nods to some classic Olympus models. For example, the power switch here is very similar to that on the original OM-1 35mm film SLR. So that's quite nice. But what they don't do is do retro for retro's sake. So there isn't a shutter speed or an aperture dial in this. You've still got two normal control dials for the thumb and the finger. But what they've done compared to the original EM10 Mark I is they've made them significantly larger. Now, Olympus realized a couple of models ago that just because the camera is small doesn't mean that the buttons and the dials need to be small. This is one of my bugbears with a lot of cameras, particularly the Sony cameras and the Fujifilm mirrorless cameras, is that they've got these tiny little buttons and dials, and they just don't provide, for me, sufficiently positive feedback. When you turn those dials, I want a nice big chunky click. I want to know when I've turned it 3 times that I've effectively done a stop's worth of shutter speed or exposure compensation or aperture adjustment. But when they're small and you it's too easy to spin past or not spin sufficiently. Not so with Olympus. These dials are big and chunky, and they turn really in a very satisfying manner, big positive clicks as you turn them. I'm very happy with the controls on this. Equally, I understand this is a very personal thing. You may not like them. You may prefer somebody else's approach, but I think Olympus has really got the balance right between retro style and modern functionality. Like its predecessor, and like all Olympus cameras, the screen is articulated and touch sensitive. The OM-D E-M10 Mark II is fully articulated. It's side hinged. This one just tilts vertically. We've discussed the pros and cons of that in previous shows. You can compose high over the heads with it angled down, or at waist height like this. But if you're composing in the portrait aspect ratio, as I often do, so the camera's like this, then having a screen that angles only vertically is of less use. Although there is the old take a picture around a corner scenario, which I have done actually a couple of times, and it works fine for that. But moving on to the 2 most important upgrades, the first of them involves the viewfinder. Now, when you look at a mid-range mirrorless camera, what the manufacturers often do is they take a higher end model and they remove features, or they hobble them so that they're not available, or they're available in a kind of lesser manner. And as a reviewer, if you're familiar with the higher end model, you can't help but go, oh, why have they done that? That's a bit annoying. I wish they'd not done that. And they did do that with the original EM10, and it felt cut down in some respects. One of those respects was the viewfinder, which wasn't as good as the higher end models. But with the EM10 Mark II, they've upgraded that. So the viewfinder panel is an OLED instead of an LCD, so that image is crisper, it's more vibrant, it's higher resolution than the previous model. It's in fact the same resolution as the EM5 Mark II and the EM1. And it's larger. The image is larger than its predecessor. It's still not as large as the EM5 Mark II or the EM1. Those are differentiators for the higher end models, but it's still pretty good. And it's in the same ballpark as the Fuji X-T10. Panasonic's Lumix G7 image is a little bit bigger still. It's very large for its class. And these are the models that you should be comparing when you're looking at this. But overall, the viewfinder experience is greatly improved on this. And as we've discussed before, the viewfinder image, even on a smaller magnification of a mid-range model, is still much larger than what you'd find on a comparably priced DSLR.
Mm. You know, it's fascinating. I was looking back. First of all, I look at this camera and I'm saying, thank goodness I'm right-handed, because it looks like the controls are, as typical, so heavily on the right side. The left side looks a little empty on the top there, doesn't it?
Yeah. Now, one thing that one of my bugbears are people who use cameras one-handed. But this is something that's very easy to do on the EM10 Mark II and the EM5 Mark II. I'm going to hold it one-handed here in my right hand, and already the rear dial is falling very comfortably under my thumb, the front dial very comfortably under my finger. I can operate both of those without adjusting my grip, which is fantastic. The other thing that makes it possible to use this camera one-handed, should you want to do that, is its built-in stabilization. This is a feature, the highlight feature of all Olympus cameras, is that rather than having optical stabilization that's only built into some lenses, they actually shift the sensor in the body. That means it works with any lens you attach, new or old, adaptive or native. You can get stabilization, and it's very effective. Now, on the original EM10, they downgraded the stabilization, again, to differentiate it from the higher end models. And I felt that was not the best move to do. It was not a 5-axis system, it was a 3-axis system. Now on the EM10 Mark II, it's gone up to the same 5-axis system as the flagship EM1. And this gives this camera between 3 and 4 stops of compensation. That's what I've actually measured in my test. That's not quoting a spec sheet, that's what I've actually discovered. Now, it's still not quite as good as the EM5 Mark II, which is that little bit more sophisticated. Its hardware is a bit better, and its superior stabilization also gives the higher end EM5 Mark II the ability to do that stitched 40 megapixel mode. You won't find that on this, but you can't sniff at 3.5 to 4 stops of compensation. And like I say, it's the same as the EM1, which is still their top model, and it gives you a beautifully stabilized image when you compose. It's just eerily steady, which is great, and you can handhold it at such slow shutter speeds. I mean, I was finding with, say, the 17mm or at around 35mm equivalent focal length, I can handhold exposures approaching 1 second. Now, that's no good if your subject is moving. If you're shooting action and you want to freeze that action, you need a fast shutter speed. And if you're shooting that in low light, you need a high ISO as well. This is not that kind of camera. But if you're shooting, say, a landscape or a building, you can do that handheld after sunset or before sunrise in the blue hour and still shoot at the lowest ISO, close down the aperture for optimal results, and get beautiful pictures. If you follow me on Instagram or Twitter or any of the other social networks, Google Plus, obviously, how we're recording this, you'll see that I regularly post images taken around that time. And when I do it with these Olympus cameras, I'm doing them handheld. And it's brilliant because it allows you to frame up one shot, take it, move on to another one without having to pack up or unfold a tripod and set that up. It allows you to move so quickly. And for me, it's extremely compelling. But that's because it matches the style of photography that I personally do.
Mm-hmm. So while we're talking about the stabilization, and you know, it is quite remarkable what these cameras can do. The Olympus stuff is phenomenal in terms of stabilization. How does this work in the case of video, and how does this camera perform in the video realm overall?
Right, well, it gives you 2 options of stabilization. On some of the older Olympus cameras, the sensor shift stabilization was not available for movies. It is on the most recent ones, and it is on the EM10 Mark II. So one of the options is to use sensor shift stabilization, and it works very well. When you've got that mode enabled, there is no crop on the video. It only does 1080p, it doesn't do 4K for filming normal video, that is. And the stabilization works great. If you go to cameralabs.com to my review of this camera, you'll see I've got a handheld clip in low light where it's stabilized really beautifully. You can't see any camera shake, and that's me after several coffees where I'm actually holding the camera like this. There is also an additional digital stabilization mode, which effectively crops the image to give it a border in which it can do some additional stabilization. That border means that you're dealing with a slightly cropped image, but it gives you even more stabilization if you want to be more ambitious with your movement. For example, if you're walking quickly or even running with it. With these cameras, I've actually chased people. They knew about it. It was in a kind of modeling scenario. It wasn't just people I felt like chasing down the street, but holding the camera in, like as if you're filming a movie, a chase sequence. And what would normally require a big Steadicam rig, I was doing handheld just with one of these. So again, the stabilization allows you to do away with a lot of additional accessories, a lot of stands, a lot of stabilizers, and end up with a very effective system that is really very, very small and affordable.
So that idea of a movable crop used as part of the stabilization makes perfect sense. I never thought of that before. Is that new in this camera, or has that been around for a while?
No, it's been around for a while. In fact, that was what the older models relied on when they were shooting movies. They couldn't actually get the sensor shift stabilization to work with the movies, or maybe they didn't want to due to the impact on battery life or heat generation. For whatever reason, they didn't allow it, but now they allow it, and they give you the choice of either sensor shift by itself or sensor shift with additional digital compensation, at which point, you know, it's giving you about 5 stops of compensation, which is pretty amazing stuff.
So that's an advantage for these cameras that have relatively high resolution sensors, as that is relative to the video resolution, because they can do that. They have extra pixels essentially that they can use. Intriguing. So how does this do overall in video? What does it do? Does it do 4K? Does it do high speed?
Okay, well, one of the things that may rule it out for some people, this camera does not have a microphone input. That is one of its differentiators with the higher end models. So if you want to connect a microphone, you're out of luck. Although that said, for a lot of my own work, when I'm filming video, I use an external recorder. I've got one of those Zoom microphone recorders, which is great. And I just sync that up afterwards. Obviously, that's not as convenient as having a high quality track recorded by the camera, but that's your choice. It doesn't have a mic input. What it does have, though, not inherited, but maybe inspired by Panasonic, the touch screen that has a pop-out interface that works really nicely. So while you're filming, you can almost silently tap the screen, pop open this tray, and adjust relatively silently things like the ISO, the aperture, the shutter speed, the microphone level for the built-in mic. And if you've got a motorized zoom, you can also operate that all within this interface quietly. So there's none of this clicking as you adjust the aperture, say with one of the physical dials. So that's a nice feature. Olympus previously on the Mark 1 version of this only let you film at 30p, which may be fine in America, but in Europe, where we have 50 hertz, 30p isn't going to help you, because when you're filming indoors, it will interfere with your AC lighting and you'll get a horrible strobing effect. And besides, what about 24p, which all the filmmakers want? So now with its most recent models, including this one, you get 24, 25, 30, 50, and 60p, all at 1080. No native 4K video on this, although one of the features that it does have is a built-in intervalometer, which allows you to take pictures at set intervals. And the camera offers to turn those into a movie if you want afterwards at various quality options. One of those quality options is 4K, although the big caveat is that it's only at 5 frames per second.
So you can do,
which is not massively useful.
A 5 frame per second time lapse that will give you 4K, but you can't actually shoot regular 4K video.
No, and in that time-lapse mode, if you go for 1080, that's also not 100% smooth. I think that's 10 or 15 frames per second. You've got to basically drop it down to 720p if you want it to be completely smooth. But it's still capturing the frames. You can still import them into software afterwards and generate a time-lapse movie at whatever resolution and frame rate you want. But it is important to note that Panasonic, for example, on models like the G7, which costs roughly the same as this, does allow you to do time-lapses in camera at up to 4K, at up to 30 frames per second, and they look great. And I've got examples of both of those. If you go to my G7 review at Camera Labs, I've got a 30 frames per second 4K version there, and I've also got the 5 frame per second version from the Olympus in my review of this camera. So, you know, I think what you find with video is that Olympus is getting a lot better than they were. The video on this is a lot better than it was on the last model, but it's still not up to, say, where Panasonic is on the G7. If video is your priority, I would go for the G7 over this model.
That's interesting. So this continues the trend of Olympus being more or less the leader in the world of image stabilization, Panasonic, on the other hand, being more of a leader in video, which again relates back to the strengths of the companies.
I think one of the interesting things about this camera, though, I mentioned at the start that when you're creating a mid-range camera, a lot of it is getting the balance right between having enough features to satisfy the enthusiasts on a budget, but not having so many that it steps on the toes of the higher end models. And what's nice is that you get a lot of the innovative shooting modes of the higher end Olympus cameras in the E-M10 Mark II. So for example, some of the things it can do, it does have an electronic shutter option. Let me show you the mechanical shutter first of all. I'm going to hold this up to the microphone and take a shot. I'm not doing a selfie.
I can actually hear that.
So that's it shooting at 8.5 frames per second, and it's quite a quiet shutter. That's the fully mechanical shutter. It has a fully electronic shutter option that's completely silent and increases the maximum shutter speed from 4,000th of a second to 16,000th. However, like all electronic shutters, there are some skewing artifacts, so it's not appropriate for subjects that are in fast motion, or even if you're moving the camera quickly, say from left to right, but it's a nice feature to have. What else you'll have in this camera are some amazing long exposure capabilities. First of all, one of the things I really like about both Olympus and Panasonic bodies is that when you're in manual mode, the maximum shutter speed is not 30 seconds, the slowest shutter speed rather, but 60 seconds. And the difference between 30 and 60 seconds when you're doing a long exposure, say, of the sea or of the sky is significant. It can be enough to actually really get you by. It looks really nice. However, if you want to do more than 1 minute exposures, it's very easy to do it on this camera without any additional accessories. Like other Olympus bodies, you can put it on a live time or live bulb mode, which you can delay the start off, so you don't need to wobble the camera, and you can set a maximum bulb time of 1 minute, 2 minutes, 4 minutes, all the way up to 30 minutes, at which point it will switch itself off or end the exposure. Better than that, though, the Olympus cameras uniquely let you peek at that exposure as it's building up. So you can actually see it on the screen, almost like you're developing a black and white print in a darkroom, and you see that picture slowly appear. You can do that with Olympus bodies in long exposures. And there's a little histogram to guide you as well, which is even better. So if you see that histogram beginning to approach the highlight area, maybe a bit sooner than you thought, you can just end the exposure. No need to wait for it to run for another 2-3 minutes. You can end it exactly at the right time. They've even got a live comp feature, which was introduced on the EM5 Mark II. What that does is it says, okay, let's say you're doing light painting or you're doing star trails, but you want something in the foreground to be exposed correctly as well. This becomes a big challenge because let's say you've got a building that's being continuously lit and you want to do maybe a 5-minute exposure to sufficiently capture the background. Well, that building's going to become way overexposed, isn't it? So what it lets you do instead is effectively stop part of the exposure, or stop the exposure in part of the picture when it's reached a sufficient brightness that you define, but to continue allowing other areas to keep exposing and being recorded. It sounds very complicated, but again, I've got some examples in my review where you can, it just makes it so easy to do light painting or star trails or any kind of long exposures. And I'm going to let you talk for a minute, Doug, but do ask me about the focus bracketing, because that is a very important new feature.
Okay, I'll do that. And before I do that, though, you know, I used one of the cameras that had this sort of watch it develop mode on the back of the camera. And I think we should point out, unless I'm mistaken, that it's not continuous. It doesn't show you the thing steadily growing. It was in chunks, and there was some limitation about the number of the interval during the interval of the length of time between the exposure evaluations. Is that right? Is it still like that?
Yeah. What you do is you tell it how many times you want to peek at it, and you allow it up to, it depends on the ISO as well. The higher the ISO, the less number of peaks you can make. But let's say, again, off the top of my head, I can't remember, but it's in the review. Let's say it's maybe 5 peaks or 10 peaks or up to 20 peaks. And you can say at what interval. Do you want them to be every 30 seconds or every 15 seconds? So you can kind of define it. And it does take a bit of trial and error to get it right. And in my tests, if you look really, really closely, I found that it did slightly increase the noise levels when you did this constant peaking. But it's still a really clever feature to have, I think, especially that histogram. And if you're remote controlling this camera with your smartphone, which you can do, it's got Wi-Fi, doesn't have NFC, but the QR code setup is very, very fast. It has very, very good remote control facilities on iOS and Android phones. And you can even peak the exposure on your phone while you're using that. And I just think they've thought it through very, very carefully. Olympus are great at saying, look, this is the hardware we've got. Now what can we do with our software and our firmware to try and exploit it in a different way to make shooting certain types of specialist photography easier, which is a great segue if you want to use it.
Oh, hey, Gordon, that reminds me. You mentioned that this camera this camera has something called focus bracketing.
Yes, it does.
What is that all about?
Okay, if you're in the bracketing menu, and again, I should point out that it'd be very easy on a mid-range camera to only offer, say, 3-frame auto exposure bracketing, but this camera has 7-frame AEB, which is great. And when you're in the bracketing section, you'll see that there's bracketing for almost everything, including, new to the EM10 Mark II, focus bracketing. Now, what this does is it adjusts the focus in very small intervals over a number of frames, between 3 and 999 frames, as I recall. So it will take a picture, shift the focus forward a little bit, or rather more distant, take a picture, shift it forward, take a picture, shift it forward, take a picture, do this. And you might think, why are you going to do that? You know, is this like exposure bracketing where you're trying to get exactly the right value? And it isn't. The reason is that you're going to stack these pictures later on using optional software. And Olympus recommends Helicon Focus, which has got a free trial. That was the software that I tried this with. Now, focus bracketing and focus stacking, who's going to do it? It's actually a very popular technique used by macro and even some product photographers. Here's the problem. Now, if you're taking a macro shot at close range, the depth of field becomes massively shallow. Now, as an example in my review, I shot 3 coins. These coins were arranged, the arrangement was about 5 centimeters in depth, okay? Now, if I had that in the viewfinder going from top to bottom, so you can imagine the sort of distance, it was from about 1 foot away. Do you like the way that I mix my imperial and metric measurements there? I like to keep you on your toes.
You're like bilingual.
Yeah, exactly. I like to have something for everyone there. Well, in that scenario, if you're using a macro lens, say at f2.8, your depth of field is only going to be about 2 millimeters. 2 millimeters. And I've got an example of that in my review. 2 millimeter thick depth of field. You're going to have very little in focus. So you think, well, if I want all those coins in focus from front to back, I'll just stop down the aperture. So you stop it down to f4, then 5, 6, then 8, then 11. And as you're doing this, you see the depth of field getting deeper, as it should, but not deep enough. And the whole time as you're going to 11 and 16 and even worse f22, you're thinking, oh no, the diffraction is going to be horrendous, which is where, because the little hole, the aperture hole is so small, especially on these smaller formats, the whole image is looking fuzzy. Now, what I found when I was shooting this arrangement is that even at f22, I wasn't getting everything from front to back in sharp focus, and the diffraction was horrendous. So the answer is focus stacking. This is where you take a shot at a much more diffraction-friendly aperture, say f2.8 or f4, and you get a strip in focus. And then you move that strip back, take a picture, move that strip back, take a picture, move it back, take a picture. And you do that enough times so that that strip of focus is basically covering the whole subject distance. And then, believe it or not, in a similar way to HDR software, focus stacking software can just pick out the sharp bits and generate this image which is sharp from front to back. Now, the way you do that in the bad old days was you'd actually have to turn the lens focusing yourself a tiny bit every time. Then some programs came along where you would actually control the camera in a tethered environment over USB. What the EM10 lets you do it is in camera. Now, it's not doing the compositing in camera, it's just doing the capture in camera. There's a few caveats. It uses the electronic shutter, which means you can get some issues with the frequency of your lighting. If it's AC-based lighting, try and use shutter speed that will match that, otherwise you might get some banding. Annoyingly, you can't trigger it with a self-timer, so you have to use a cable release if you don't want to wobble it. You can't trigger it from over Wi-Fi with the phone either, which is a bit annoying. But once you get it going, it's really fun. What you do is you set the focus at the closest part of your composition. You choose a number of frames, you choose a focus differential, which is how much you want it to move between those frames, and you set it off. And as it takes the pictures, and it takes about, I was using bursts of say 100 frames, which would take about 3 seconds. You see this little plane of focus move up the screen as it gets further away. And you think, oh, that's really nice. And then on the very last frame, you play it back. And if it looks sharp and your first one's sharp, you think, right, I've nailed it. The only thing you have to worry about then is, was that band wide enough for there to be some overlap? And if there is, you've done it. You import all those frames into Helicon Focus or some other software, and you generate this macro picture, which is sharp from front to back. While we were having this discussion, you were free to overlay those images. So the image that hopefully Doug will show you right now is the finished version, which was made up of 100 frames, which is sharp from front to back. A very easy process. Although the one other caveat is that when you keep taking bursts of 100 frames, you burn through your battery very quickly. Because if the battery life is only about 300 frames, then you do the math.
Really an interesting idea. You're right. Olympus has been very good about taking the hardware they have and looking at all the possible things they might be able to do with it. They've been very impressive in that regard. So, you know, you and I have done a lot of reviews. This is about the 51st review on All About the Gear. You've done hundreds of camera reviews over the life of cameralabs.com. And again, please do go to cameralabs.com, everyone, because there you will be up all night reading the long form review of the Olympus OM-D E-M10 Mark II, but all your questions will be answered. So the original of this camera came out just in January of 2014. So it's been less than 2 years. The upgrade rate of these cameras is just phenomenal. So we not only do we have so many models to choose from, between in Micro Four Thirds, we have the Olympus and the Panasonic Lumix, but then we have a lot of cameras to choose from within a manufacturer's line. Help me. I mean, this EM10 Mark II is a very capable camera. As I said, with the Mark I, I was very impressed with it. And in fact, I took some images that won some awards at the local camera club. And I was surprised when I went back and looked at the images from a year ago that sure enough, one of them actually was taken with that little camera. Help me understand where this camera fits relative to the other cameras that are available today in the Micro Four Thirds line. How do you decide if this is the right camera for you?
Well, in terms of a mid-range camera, as I've said earlier in the review, I think the EM10 Mark II, in terms of features and price and handling, goes up against the Lumix G7 from Panasonic, which is another Micro Four Thirds camera. As I've mentioned before, better for video. Also has a fully articulated screen, which I personally prefer, and a slightly larger viewfinder image. And it has that whole 4K video thing, and also the ability to grab photos from 4K footage. G7 is a very, very compelling camera, although it does not have the image stabilization of the Olympus. And personally, I feel the handling is a bit nicer on the Olympus. Other models to consider, Fujifilm's X-T10, which I showed you earlier, and we will be doing a review of this. Image quality is gorgeous from the Fujifilm. It's one of my favorite formats, the X series. It has a slightly larger APS-C sensor. It's maintained a relatively modest 16 megapixel resolution, so it's got slightly fatter pixels. Different kind of color filter array, which combined with their image processing and their lovely lenses means that I just find the image quality of the Fujifilm system very, very nice. It also has the benefit of some phase detect AF points, a little scattering of them in the middle of the sensor, which allows it to do better continuous AF than you'd think, but only if the subject's in the middle. This camera, the X-T10, is really all about image quality. I think it's more a camera that is for someone who aspires to the X-T1 but can't afford it, or who has an X-T1 and wants a backup camera. Personally speaking, I think the Olympus and the Panasonic are probably easier to use and more responsive for a kind of upgrader or somebody who's going for a mid-range camera based on they want great results that are easy to get. But don't let that put you off the X-T10. It is a really, 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 really nice camera. Then the Sony's a6000, which we keep talking about. It's an older model, but its key selling point is that it has its sensor is covered in embedded phase detect AF points. Here's the a6000, which allows it to continuously autofocus very effectively almost anywhere on the frame, and it will do so at the top shooting speed of 11 frames per second. Now, I personally do not get on very well with the controls of this camera or the ergonomics. The viewfinder spec is looking very dated compared to these other models I've mentioned, but if you're shooting action, it's a fantastic camera to go for, and also highly discounted right now. One of the interesting things about the Olympus, though, is where it fits in its own range, because a lot of people go, well, why should I go for the higher end OM-D E-M5 Mark II, which after all is about $1,050 for the body alone. So let's remind ourselves it's about $650 for this body alone. So that's getting on for twice the price. $400 difference. That's quite significant. So why would you go for the EM5 Mark II? Well, here are its differentiators. As I've mentioned elsewhere in the review, the viewfinder spec, the panel resolution and type is the same as the EM5 Mark II, but the EM5 Mark II image is bigger, comfortably bigger. That image is much bigger and more immersive. The screen is still 3-inch and touch sensitive, but it's side hinged and fully articulated. I've already discussed why I prefer that. I think that's much more useful. The EM5 Mark II also has weatherproofing, which this camera does not. So these are all, I should mention as well, it has the mic input, it has slightly superior stabilization, slightly faster continuous shooting speed, and it also, thanks to its superior stabilization, offers that composite 40 megapixel mode, which requires your subject to stay still, but if it does, you can actually eke out high resolution from this sensor, which is otherwise 16 megapixels per frame. Is that worth $400 extra? That's a tricky one to answer. I really, really like the EM5 Mark II. It's one of my favorite cameras right now, but the EM10 Mark II is just coming in at such a compelling price point with most of the features that you'd want. I should also mention that focus stacking capability, or rather the focus bracketing capability, is coming to the EM5 Mark II and the EM1 with a firmware update by the end of 2015. And the deeper buffer on the flagship EM1 will also allow it to do a comp in camera, but only of 10 frames. And as you'll see, the picture that I showed you earlier, it actually had 100 frames. So I don't know how useful a 10-frame comp will be in practice, but it's nice to see Olympus equipping those older models with these new features.
Well, very good. My impression, and I have not used this camera myself, but having used the previous version, is I would say that the EM10 is a terrific camera for probably two purposes. One is as an entry level to the Micro Four Thirds world. If you're on a budget, it's a great place to start. So is the G7, I would say, again, if you're more interested in the video. And even with this zoom lens, that although I was critical of it early in the review, just the fact that for $800 you can get a complete camera that's got the body and a zoom lens, great place to start. And as often the case for these less expensive cameras, a terrific second body. So if you're into the Micro Four Thirds world and you want to go out and you want to travel, but you want to have a backup for $650 US, you can get a terrific backup second body. Marvelous cameras. And by the way, for those of you who are either just getting started with Micro Four Thirds, or if you're looking to upgrade your lenses, Gordon has probably the most complete set of reviews on what are the best Micro Four Thirds lenses over at Timelapse.com. I highly recommend that because the benefit of Micro Four Thirds, of course, is this large stable of lenses from multiple manufacturers. So head over to Cameralabs.com, check that out. By the way, if you are interested in purchasing any of the cameras, as always, please go to Cameralabs.com, click on the buy now links that you'll find there. They help everybody put food on the table here at All About the Gear. Gordon, another terrific review. This is a great little camera. I look forward to playing with one myself.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'd like to sum up with on it is, and this is what makes it so successful as a mid-range camera as well, is that all of Olympus's technology is in there. From the continuous autofocus is not fantastic. If you're into tracking sports, this is not the camera for you. But its single AF speed is very, very fast, and it works in very low light, and it has fantastic face and eye detection. Put all that together, and you've got a camera that can snap onto someone's face wherever they are in the frame very, very quickly, even with a shallow depth of field in a portrait scenario. And it's just so easy to get pictures at parties or of your kids without them having to pose. And it's just, and with the art filters as well, if you want to get creative, you can get some really nice effects very, very simply with this camera. It just makes it very easy to get very, very good results. And that is such an important thing to have, I think, on a camera of this class, because part of the target audience are going to be people upgrading from a much simpler camera. And what they don't want to do is to go to a more sophisticated one and think, oh no, my results are rubbish. I don't have time to learn this, or I just want to get great results right now. And this camera will give you that. So that's one of my favorite things about it. It gives you those great results very quickly and easily, but it's also got loads of features to grow with you if you want to do something more sophisticated in the future.
Very good. All right. Well, Gordon, thank you once again for another terrific episode. I look forward to seeing you on the next one.